I prefer a world run by the UN norms than the US norms. You look at Ukraine, nobody's doing mediation. Nobody's calling in the UN. The UN was also not called in Donbass. If we had set down 300,000 UN troops in Donbass, there would not have been a war today. I belong to those who feel that the United Nations is awfully important, where a lot of people say, oh, it's useless. First of all, please understand that the world's countries use 300 to 400 times more per year on armament than they give to the United Nations. I mean, the idea that the United Nations to solve the problems of warfare is totally ridiculous when you have such perverse priorities in the world. It should be the opposite, if you ask me. If we imagine we gave 300 times more to the United Nations and peacemaking organizations in general than we give to the armament and arms production and ammunition, then we would have a much more peaceful world. I have never expressed disappointment with the United Nations. I have expressed disappointment with the ways members of the United Nations are members. This was formulated in 1948 by the first Secretary General of the United Nations, the Norwegian Trygve Lie, who said the United Nations will never be better or stronger than the members want to make it. So if the Western world, and that's basically the Western world, that has undermined the United Nations, marginalized it, made it useless, continue to do what they will do, we will live in a world in which there is no norms and rules left. And it's up to anyone to do it. In parentheses, may I say that I'm very happy to see that you cannot probably hear a speech or a public statement by the Chinese president or foreign minister in which the United Nations is not emphasized as an important thing. Now, the reason I find the United Nations important is something that most people tend to overlook, and that is a normative power. The power of the norms and values put into the Charter. The Charter of the UN is the most important document ever signed by governments. And one reason is that Article 1 says peace shall be established by peaceful means. Did you hear that? Peace shall be established by peaceful means. That's a Gandhian formulation. The means are the goals in the making. You can't use violent means to get to peace. But what is also built into the Charter is that all civilian means shall have been tried and found in vain before what is called Chapter 7 is invoked and actualized, and that is where the United Nations can take military action against somebody who violates international law. For instance, an aggressor over a border. Everything shall have been tried, and violence shall be the last resort, and it shall be conducted, if you have an international military action, by the UN's military committee, not by NATO, not by the US, not by anybody else, but by the organization. Now, that was already destroyed in the Korean War. But we have this to refer to. And when somebody violates it and makes a genocide in Gaza or violates an international border, we can hold them accountable because that is in the fundamental document of international law. Those who say we could just as well close it down, it doesn't mean a thing, have not understood anything about power. The power of the UN is not its present budget or organization, which is outdated, and the Security Council, which is outdated. The power of the UN is the world's people can refer to and say, you do what you are not allowed to do, and you should stop it. The moment we don't have that, it'll be the law of the jungle. It'll be the might makes right. And that is a much more difficult world and dangerous world. I prefer a world run by the UN norms than the US norms. I vividly remember in the 90s, I sat with a Deputy Secretary General of the UN in New York, and he had read our report on on the Yugoslavia. Funnily enough, that was when anybody could walk into the center of the UN building in New York and say, I want to see this guy on 13th floor. And they would call up and say, yeah, you can go up there. There was no check of anything. You could walk into the Yugoslav desk or the Middle East desk or whatever, and you could talk freely with people. Oh, that's another thing today. That's all this security thing, But that Deputy Secretary General said, it's an excellent report. This is a type of work we need in the UN, but let me say one thing, and he said it almost with tears in his eyes. Let me tell you that this organization here, the UN, does not have the capacity to do anything about a conflict before we have read for 3 or 4 weeks in New York Times that there's a war. You see what that means? Think of the difference, how much better the world would be if you could catch conflicts diplomatically, deal with them politically, mediation, listening to parties. Imagine we had defensive mediation organizations instead of NATO, and the UN then backing them up, so that we could catch legitimate conflicts, people's grievances, before they blow up in violence and warfare that may last a long time. And as I used to say, when you use violence, you have 2 problems, not just the original conflict, but you have the fact that I've slapped your face and you hate me for that. You slap my face and I hate you for that, and then we have a double problem. So the reason that diplomacy has disappeared finally is also it requires knowledge, experience. It is much more complex than starting a war. So we are back to my main argument, intellectual and moral disarmament. I think with that, the answer will always be, we need more weapons. And you deny that you are into an addiction, exactly as the guy who drinks too much will say, no, I don't have an alcohol problem. The West has a militarism problem, as bad as somebody who drinks too much and denies that he or she has a drinking and alcohol problem. That's where we are in the West now. You look at Ukraine, the solution is push in weapons to Ukraine so they can make Russia weaker or win over Russia. Look at Gaza. Nobody's doing mediation. Nobody's calling in the UN. The UN was also not called in Donbass. If we had set down 300,000 UN troops in Donbass, there would not have been a war today. But nobody in the Western world has suggested that the United Nations could get into and do in Ukraine, Donbass, what it did in Crimea. Notice the similarity. Ukraine is a country. Crimea was a region in Croatia. Crimea means border. The one in Croatia had to do with pockets of Serbs, minorities, who did not want to live in a Croatian state because they were exterminated in the Second World War by Pavelić's regime. Now the Serbs remembered that and said, we can live in a Yugoslavia, we can live in a republic that is Croatia, that is part of Yugoslavia. We cannot live in a nationalist Croatia because we run the risk of being exterminated once again. Now that may be right or wrong, that's not the idea. But the UN went in and kind of, made the parties talk with each other and not shoot at each other. Imagine we had done that in southeastern Ukraine. Why is it that the thing that was natural to do in the 90s in Yugoslavia and had successful results, why did nobody suggest to the United Nations in Ukraine? They're the only organization that could have made a difference in that region. And if I remember correctly, Putin suggested that at an early stage, long before the invasion, that we need somebody who can protect the local people, disarm those who start fighting. How many 100,000 people are being killed in Ukraine? How many generations will it take before Ukraine is back to a welfare state and has a good economic development? Where will this war end? Are we going to try to split up Russia the way we split up Yugoslavia? It's not going to happen. And it will take even more generations to repair the relationship between the Russian people, no matter the leader, but the Russian people and the European people. So I think that diplomacy has been canceled. We will never talk to Putin. you can't solve any problems. I'm sorry. Conflict resolution is for speaking with people who have difficulties in speaking. It's not with each other. Conflict resolution is about learning to speak with those who have different views and find a way to live with them. We can't move Russia to another place on earth or something like that. It's totally short-sighted, anti-intellectual, immoral. So instead, we should build people-to-people bridges between the Russian people and the Europeans, and from below pressure the governments on all sides, NATO, Ukraine and Russia, to move together and find a modus vivendi, a way to live together, trade with each other, respect each other. I think it's perfectly doable, but every day this conflict lasts longer, it'll become more difficult.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化，强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，护肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。